Well, that was devastating. This week's Invincible, titled All I Can Say Is I'm Sorry, is not just my favorite of the season so far, it is easily one of my favorites in the show's history. It's a prime example of the ways this show is willing to explore the trickle effect of a superhero-powered world, and ways our heroes' actions, even when righteous, can have lasting, devastating effects on the world and its citizens. It's about how when the world leaves its citizens behind, they desperately seek out somewhere to put the blame, some explanation as to why things are happening to them. It asks whether or not heroes, even ones that are trying to help the world, should be made to answer to that world for the decisions they make. In fact, I think this episode basically succeeds where another massive big-budget blockbuster superhero movie failed at exploring very similar themes, and I can't wait to dive into it more. Spoilers for the episode All I Can Say Is I'm Sorry ahead, and I just want to once again kindly ask y'all not to spoil the comics for anybody in the comments. Thanks. Okay, obviously there's a lot in this episode, but yes, the focus of this video is Scott Duvall, aka Powerplex, played by guest star Aaron Paul, who is excellent.
Hooray!
The episode opens with a flashback scene set during the events of episode 108, the season 1 finale. It shows Scott spending an afternoon with his sister and niece in Chicago before revealing that it takes place during the big Invincible/Omni-Man disaster. I highly recommend going back and rewatching these moments from 108 as well, because it adds a whole additional devastating layer to the circumstance as you see Jessica and Gretchen's final moments and how hard Mark fought to save them. But all Scott sees is Invincible and Omni-Man fighting, causing unimaginable destruction, leading to the horrifying death of his sister and niece. Okay, I'm just gonna get into this now. This entire episode is doing Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, but, well, better. Both open showcasing prior events in the timeline from a new perspective. BVS shows the climax of Man of Steel, Invincible shows the events in Chicago. And both try to show that, from another perspective, it's harder to see Invincible or Superman as a hero, and pretty easy to see them as the source of death and devastation. And both of these narratives deal with not only the people who suffered most in these devastating events, but how the world has left those people behind, and how they feel that the heroes in question should have some level of culpability. Compounded by the fact that these heroes are put on pedestals and heralded as saviors without even an investigation into their thought processes or decision making during those events. Obviously, we as an audience saw in 108 that the circumstances were near impossible to avoid, that Mark was doing what he thought he needed to do to save the most people. We literally saw that Mark tried desperately to save Jessica and Gretchen specifically, and that he was absolutely gutted with despair when he failed. But we're looking at things from the perspective of a viewer who gets full context. The world does not get this context, and though some people choose to believe that Mark did everything he could and was just trying to do the right thing, it's hard to accept this for the people who have suffered and lost so much, especially when nobody seems to care about their loss. Scott initially tries to incite an investigation into the Chicago event simply so that they can know more about what happened, if Invincible was culpable in any way, but they refuse to even consider it because, as the world sees it, Invincible is a hero who did the right thing.
Look, it feels like their deaths don't matter.
I have never been a huge fan of Snyder's BVS, but I will say the one thing I do respect most about it is its inclination to explore this question in regards to Superman. This one man has so much power, and though we know Superman is trying to do the right thing, should that person be made to answer to the people he is trying to help? Does he owe them explanations on his thought processes and decision making when he is trying to save the world? Should people just trust that he is doing the right thing with that power, even when the outcome completely upends their lives? Of course, BVS mostly uses this as a jumping off point into the muddier Batman vs Superman story, but I do think it has some pretty interesting takes in regards to these questions. I think where BVS fails is in its characterization of Superman. If we had maybe seen Superman's more personal connection to the people he saved over the course of these movies, and how much he actually does care about humanity, this question would have been one that created more dramatic conflict. But I think those movies really fail to show Superman's humanity in a way that's true to the character, which is exactly where this episode of Invincible succeeds, because we know firsthand, particularly through the dialogue during his fight with Nolan, that Mark truly and genuinely cares about humanity, that Earth is his home and he will do anything he can to protect it and its people. We know because we saw Mark try to save Jessica and Gretchen desperately, and we saw that it destroyed him when he failed. We know these things weigh on him. So this episode does this amazing job showcasing both of these realities that coexist. The one where we know that Mark did everything he could could, and where we also know that from Scott's perspective, he couldn't possibly know that Mark did everything he could. It will always be this horrifying question that nobody is willing to entertain. He just has to sit and accept the notion that a hero tried but failed, and people will still put him on a pedestal for that failure.
Heroes like him leave thousands dead in their wake.
And eventually, that this nagging pain from being left behind and ignored will lead him down a revenge-driven path that turns him into the exact thing he was fighting against. But we will get there, because the other thing I love so much about this episode is that all of its smaller subplots thematically tie into these questions in regards to heroes and citizens' places in the society. Scott in this episode is basically forced to reconcile with the idea that heroes don't have to answer to society in the same ways that citizens do. And obviously this episode is largely about perspective and how from his point of view, they're afforded free reign. This is further explored through a couple smaller sequences. One, when Debbie's new boo Paul is trying to relate to the kids at dinner. Mark, Eve, and Oliver are all heroes, and Paul sort of haphazardly tries to compare what they do to his experience in real estate, which Oliver outright laughs at, but I think Paul's sort of embarrassment goes a long way to highlight this societal divide. Paul is ashamed he even considered comparing his experience to theirs, and they in turn laughed at the notion. But I think what Debbie says here is one of the most important quotes in the episode.
Just because we aren't saving the world doesn't mean our jobs aren't important.
This is kind of what the entire episode is about. There's this feeling that superheroes are more important because of what they're capable of and the work they can do to save people. But it's a double-edged sword where it can make people like Scott feel unimportant, like the lives they failed to save don't matter. There's a reason that saving lives matters, though. It's because all of these lives are important. Though this Paul sequence is small and kind of funny, it really lends to the thematic resonance of the episode. How can these classifications of people coexist in society and have different rules and different perceptions without things getting messy? Obviously, with the powerplex of it all, the answer is they sort of can't. This idea also lends to the excellent Rex and Ray scenes in this episode, where Ray decides she's going to quit being a hero. And this shows the flip side of the expectations that come with being a hero. Though it appears to the outside world that the heroes have free reign and don't have to answer to anyone, the reality is they have their own set of rules that can often be pretty messed up. Rex and Ray were both forced into heroism as kids, in different circumstances, and have existed in this world largely against their will. They don't get to have a normal life, and I love how this episode showcases that some heroes want a normal life. In regards to Rex, he's somebody who has never really had his own identity outside of this superhero persona. So not only is he somebody who doesn't have a regular life to go back to, he wouldn't even know how to have a regular life. The last sequence that I think really lends to these themes of the episode focus on Oliver and perspective. Oliver struggles with the idea that his father is not only a bad person, but that the entire world sees him as this bad person, particularly when he only has these amazing memories of him, and that he believes if his mother loved Nolan, that he must have been good. He struggles to understand that Nolan could have done heroic things and unspeakably evil things. Oliver's desire for Nolan's good qualities to be seen alongside his bad qualities is really difficult for him to reconcile with, that there are these two sides to Nolan, and that the things he did to Earth could never really fully be made up for in the eyes of Earth's citizens, no matter how righteous. And I think this ties to the Powerplex dilemma on a larger scale. It's all about that perspective, where Powerplex sees the damage that was directly caused by Invincible's actions, and no matter what people say Mark has done to save others, it doesn't make up for it to him. Okay, let's dive back into that Powerplex storyline, because while I do love the way this episode helps you empathize with Scott and people who have suffered like him in this superpowered world, they also take this revenge storyline to its most devastating conclusion. Because the world leaves him behind and he sees no other options, Scott tries to take matters into his own hands. He gets a job at the GDA and starts investigating the events himself. He starts stealing tech that helps charge up his limited electricity abilities so that he can actually find justice for himself. His wife is even there to support him every step of the way, down to listening to and advising on his monologue for Invincible when he finally faces him. Of course, the other major aspect of this episode is that Mark basically dodges every opportunity to face Powerplex that arises, leading to more frustration from Scott, making him feel even more insignificant. During their first possible encounter, Scott jumps off a building to charge up and starts calling out for Invincible while on the news. During this, Mark is at William's birthday at the bowling alley, which is overall another great scene. I really loved seeing Mark and Amber reunite for the first time in their new lives, and how much better they're both doing in their new relationships. It was charming to see. I really appreciate that they both still have so much love for each other, despite things not working out between them and them knowing that things are better off now. But what really stuck out during this scene was that when Mark turns off the news before he can hear Powerplex call out for Invincible, basically everyone who knows knows that Mark is invincible, was a little confounded by his behavior.
What? I can take a night off. You know there's other heroes out there, right?
I think particularly with Amber and Eve reacting so confusedly, especially with Amber not having seen Mark in quite a while and really seeing the contrast between how he was in previous seasons and how he is now. Just another example of how Mark's attitude has really shifted this season. But Powerplex's experience fighting Shapesmith instead of Invincible is so vital to the slippery slope he slides down over this story. Obviously, Powerplex wants to face Invincible. He didn't intend to fight anybody else. And so when Shapesmith shows up, he mostly tries to ignore him, to brush him off, until Shapesmith just starts pummeling the shit out of him. That pummeling obviously charges up Scott's electrical abilities, and ultimately, he fully zaps the hell out of Shapesmith to the point where the bystanders think that Shapesmith might be dead. This could have been such a turning point for Scott if he hadn't been so driven by revenge, because he was basically on the other end of exactly what he experienced with Invincible. He knows that he wasn't trying to hurt Shapesmith. He was in full defense mode, but to the bystanders, it looked like Scott fully attacked and nearly killed him.
He attacked me! You saw what happened!
Oh man, you saw what happened hits so hard here, because yeah, they did see what happened, but their perception of exactly what went down didn't have the full context. They only saw what they saw. And so now, Scott is being judged by these bystanders in a wildly negative way, the same exact way he judged Invincible. And I'm not saying he doesn't have the right to question the events of Chicago. It's a near impossible scenario to even comprehend. Of course you would want answers, but if Scott had not been quite so far down that revenge-driven path, maybe this could have been the wake-up call he needed to understand how tough it is to fully grasp the context of these kinds of complicated superpowered scenarios. Only Scott knew his intentions, and everyone else judged his intentions based on what they saw. Does that sound familiar, Scott? We haven't even really touched on Scott's family and how his and his wife's revenge-driven obsession is basically leading to them neglecting their toddler. This man is doing everything in pursuit of justice without realizing how his actions are actually causing more harm to those around him. And his wife is the one who tells him he'll get another shot at Invincible at the memorial service for the victims of the events in Chicago, where he interrupts the speeches and once again tries to lure out Mark. But this time, Eve and Debbie convince Mark to stay back while Eve deals with it. Eventually, the Guardians show up, and once again, Scott feels fully ignored by Invincible. With the rage he's already feeling, to have two separate public incidents like this both go awry, man, this dude has just gotta be seething at this point. You go fully ignored when you voice your concerns, and then when you take matters into your own hands, you still get ignored? Not a surprise that he busts out of the prison truck and tries one more time. I love how this event affects Mark, though. Though he didn't face Powerplex, the incident basically shifts his perspective and forces him to really face the reality of what happened in Chicago. We know the events weighed on him, but even earlier in the episode, he considered not going to the memorial. He said he thought it might be disrespectful, but I think it's obvious it was because he was afraid to reconcile with the destruction he was a part of. Now, after he heard the cries of somebody who was affected by that destruction, he considers his part in it. One thing that really sticks out to me this entire episode is Scott's emotional state. It's clear that he only sees his actions as a last resort, sort of a desperation move. He's not getting anything positive out of it. During the scene earlier when he's practicing his monologue for Invincible, he just immediately starts sobbing afterwards. And this emotional state is sold so well by Aaron Paul, who just does an incredible job with his performance. And obviously the big climax is where it's best showcased. After escaping the prison truck, he and his wife decide that pretending that she and their son have been kidnapped by him and held hostage is the only way to lure out Invincible. This scene in the ruins of the very building where Invincible failed to save Jessica and Gretchen is so good. It showcases Mark's genuine remorse as he desperately tries to apologize for his failures. But most importantly, Scott expresses that issue at the core of this episode. He needs to know why Invincible gets the privilege of being superpowered, why he sits in a different class when so many others die in these superpowered events.
What makes you so special?
I think this is a question that sort of extends into our real world. At its core, it's just, why do some people have more privilege? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why isn't life fair? Obviously, this is true in the real world as well, but particularly in this world with heroes and villains, many of these things have such explosive, violent consequences. Maybe most chillingly, Scott expresses his biggest issue with Invincible right before his revenge drives him to become that very thing. I can't say enough about this electric climax, as Scott finally gets the best of Mark and fills his attack with all of that seething rage and resentment he's been feeling, doing what he felt was the right and justified thing to help people, only for those powers to extend beyond his control, killing his own wife and child. Holy shit. We know Scott wasn't doing the right thing here, but for him to be so committed in his belief that he was getting justice for people who have been wronged, only to enact the same kind of collateral damage that led him to believe this about Invincible in the first place, it's just so brutal. I love this scene at the prison after this in particular, where Mark tries desperately to convey his regret to Scott, to convey how he's still growing and how this is going to help him be a better hero. And I just love how Scott's reaction highlights how tone deaf this was for Mark to say. This man lost his entire family through these events, and Mark is standing there telling him to feel comfort for the ways it helped him, the person that Scott blames for all of this. Read the room, dude. I love Mark. I know he tries his best, but I think one of the things that makes this show so great is the fact that Mark is still growing and learning. He's super young still, but his actions have massive consequences, so his growing pains hurt more people than just himself. The way we all reconcile with the mistakes we've made in our lives, Mark has to reconcile with 10 times bigger mistakes because of the nature of his place in the society. That's one of the biggest through lines we've seen through these 3 seasons. I mentioned that BVS sort of uses the whole "who does Superman answer to" concept as a jumping off point, and I do really wish that it reconciled with it more in its resolution, but obviously it turns into something a lot bigger and more comic booky by the end of that movie. But I think Invincible takes the idea to its most devastating conclusion, and it actually ties to the season's themes really effectively. In the beginning of the season, Mark is very self-righteous about his heroism, about who should and shouldn't be allowed to be a hero, whose pasts should exclude them from being able to help moving forward. And then slowly his confidence in these ideals are weathered down over the season, through Oliver asking questions about their dad and if the good he did matters when he's also done bad, through his experience in the future, being forced to kill the tyrannical future version of Immortal, despite him knowing Immortal as somebody who saved so many people, and now through reconciling with the fact that though he believed he was doing the right thing throughout the events in Chicago, his actions did still have consequences. Every single minute detail in the decisions he made during these kinds of life and death situations affect so many people, affect so many paths. If he had managed to save Jessica and Gretchen, Scott wouldn't have fallen down this revenge-driven path and become the very thing he sought justice against. Okay, let's see if there are any odds and ends to talk about that I didn't fit into this video so far. I know a lot of people loved the Invincible title drop in this episode, but man, it kind of annoyed the hell out of me. Dropping the title card every time Powerplex yells his name over and over again. I think it's funny as like a meme, but in an episode this heavy, I wasn't a huge fan. That's just me though. I adore how Rex and Ray's relationship is developed, not a pairing I'd ever considered, and they really just work together. It's super cute. Rudy actually figuring out a way to stop Amanda's de-aging problem with her abilities, that's such a great scene. Even though it's filled with the funniest mishmash of science x magic mumbo jumbo, but seeing Amanda so grateful for what Rudy did for her, it's a really lovely sequence. And then of course we've got to talk about the post-credit scene. Here it comes, y'all. The full reveal that the drones do in fact belong to Angstrom Levy, and that he seemingly has his own personal army of Invincibles, prepping to take revenge on our Mark for the events of the season 2 finale. Honestly, one of my biggest issues with season 2 was that the Angstrom Levy stuff felt so minimal in the scheme of the story, and so to find out this was really just a part 1 of a bigger story, it feels right, even though I constantly complain about characters dying and coming back to life in this show. This time it works for me. And I imagine with all those Invincibles that this is the upcoming Invincible War people keep bringing up in my comment section. I think there's little doubt that we're about to see an absolutely insane end to season 3 in these final 2 episodes. But what do you think about episode 6, Powerplex, and the upcoming Angstrom Invincible stuff? Are you enjoying season 3? Let me know below in the comments, and I'll catch you next week. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust them.